The last card slapped the felt-covered table with a sound like a gunshot in the sudden quiet of the saloon. Marcus Fletcher, a man whose smile was as polished as his silver watch chain, stared at the hand laid out before the mountain man. A full house. Aces over kings. It was a hand of brutal, simple finality. Fletcher's own flush, a thing of beauty moments before, was now just a collection of colored paper. The pot was enormous. Gold dust, coins, a deed to a played-out claim, and the promissory note for a horse. But that was not the final item in the pile. Abel Croft did not smile. He was a man built of the mountain he lived on, wide in the shoulder and thick through the chest, with hands that looked more suited to splitting logs than holding playing cards. He reached a slow, deliberate hand to rake in his winnings, his gaze never leaving Fletcher's face. "That's everything," Fletcher said, his voice a little too smooth. Except for the final wager, he gestured with his chin toward the back of the room, near the kitchen door. A young woman stood there, small and still, her hands clasped in front of a plain, dark tunic. She was Chinese, no older than 18, with a face as composed and unreadable as a stone. "The girl," Fletcher said, his tone making it clear she was an object, a piece of property like the horse or the claim. Her indenture. Worthless on the docks, but perhaps useful to a man living alone. A murmur went through the room. Winning a man's property was one thing. Winning a person was another. Abel's hand paused over the pile of gold. He hadn't wagered for the girl. He had wagered for the stake he needed to buy seed and a new plow blade. The girl had been Fletcher's final, desperate addition to the pot, a flourish to prove how much he had to lose. Abel looked at her. She did not flinch under his gaze, or under the hungry eyes of the other men in the saloon. She simply stood, her own eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, as if she were 1,000 miles away. He didn't want the trouble. He didn't want the complication. But a bet was a bet. He gave a single, hard nod. The ride up the mountain was silent. Abel led the way on his sturdy gelding, while the girl, Lynn, followed on the tired mare he'd also won. She rode with a straight back, her small bundle of possessions tied behind her. She did not speak. She did not look at him. She looked at the trees, the rocks, the way the light slanted through the high pines. Abel felt her silence as a weight. It was an accusing silence, a watchful one. He was used to quiet, but this was different. This was the quiet of a trapped animal. They arrived at his homestead as the sun was setting, painting the high peaks in shades of orange and deep purple. The cabin was small, made of logs he had felled and notched himself, with a stone chimney breathing a thin line of smoke into the cooling air. It was a place of profound isolation, nestled in a high meadow miles from the nearest neighbor. From the porch, a small girl with hair the color of straw watched them approach. She was perhaps 8 years old, with her father's serious eyes. She held a cornhusk doll in one hand and did not move as Abel dismounted. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She will be staying here." He did not use the girl's name. He wasn't sure he knew it. He gestured for Lynn to dismount, and she slid from the horse with a quiet grace that surprised him. She stood before the cabin, a tiny figure against the immense backdrop of the wilderness, her face giving away nothing. Sarah's eyes, wide and solemn, took her in from head to toe. This was her home, and a stranger had just been brought to its door. Abel grunted, turning to unsaddle the horses. The bargain was done. But the cost, he suspected, was only just beginning to be counted. The cabin was a testament to a life pared down to its essentials. It was clean, meticulously so, but held no softness. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, a long plank table and 2 benches filled the center, and 2 rope beds were built into the far wall. One was Abel's, the other belonged to Sarah. There was a third, smaller mattress, a simple tick filled with straw, tucked into the corner by the cold wood stove. That, it was understood without a word, was for Lynn. A rocking chair sat empty by the hearth, its wood worn smooth by use, but now it seemed to hold only dust and memory. It was the only object in the room that spoke of a life before this one, a life that had included a wife and a mother. The grief in the house was not loud, it was in the very grain of the wood, in the way Abel moved around the empty chair, in the premature gravity on Sarah's small face. Abel's world ran on a rhythm of relentless work. From sunup to sundown, he moved with a purpose that left no room for talk. He chopped wood, mended fences, tended his small herd of cattle, and worked his large vegetable garden. This patch of cultivated earth was their survival, its bounty meant to see them through the long, brutal mountain winters. He gave Lynn no instructions. He simply rose one morning, drank his coffee black and scalding, and went out. His expectation was clear: she would find her use, or she would be useless. Lynn watched him go. She saw Sarah, already awake, quietly fetching water from the pump, her small shoulders straining under the weight of the bucket. The child moved with the economy of an adult, her face set in a permanent frown of concentration. She was doing chores that had once belonged to her mother, and the burden had stolen the lightness from her body. Lynn felt a familiar ache. She knew what it was to be a child forced to carry adult weight. She looked at her own small bundle, a pathetic collection of mended clothes and a single, small, cloth-wrapped object. She was a guest here only by the turn of a card, a piece of property with no rights and no voice. But she had hands. She had always had her hands. She started in the house. She swept the floor, her movements quiet and efficient. She banked the fire. She took the thin stew left over from the night before and went outside. A short distance from the cabin, she found a patch of wild onion and sorrel growing near the creek. She washed the greens carefully and added them to the pot, along with a pinch of salt she found in a wooden box on the mantel. She did not presume to cook a full meal, only to improve what was there. Then, she walked to the vegetable garden. It was a large plot, well ordered in the way of a man who values function over form. Long, straight rows of beans, corn, squash, and potatoes. It was productive, but Lynn's eyes saw more. She saw the way the sun hit the western edge of the plot, baking the soil dry. She saw how the squash plants were crowding the beans, fighting for light. She saw the soil itself, heavy and clay-like. It was a garden built with muscle, not knowledge. And knowledge was the one thing she possessed in abundance. She began her work at the far edge of the garden. One small thing at a time. She didn't touch the main crops, not yet. That would be an overstep. Instead, she started on the weeds, her fingers moving with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. She didn't just pull them, she teased their roots from the soil, ensuring they would not return. She worked for hours, the sun hot on her back, her silence as profound as Abel's. Sarah came out and watched her from the porch, her doll clutched to her chest. She watched as Lynn cleared a space and then began to gather pine needles from the forest floor, spreading them carefully around the base of the tomato plants. A mulch, to hold the moisture in. It was a simple thing, a small thing, but it was the first act of change in this house of rigid routine. That evening, when Abel came in from the fields, he did not comment on the neatly weeded rows or the blanket of pine needles. But he saw it. And when he ate the stew, he paused for a moment after the first spoonful, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, before he continued eating in his usual stoic silence. The summer weeks bled one into the next, marked by the slow ripening of the corn and the lengthening of the shadows in the evening. Lynn's presence began to weave itself into the fabric of the homestead, subtly at first, then with a quiet permanence. Her days were a study in constant, gentle motion. She rose before the sun, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floorboards, and would have a fire going in the hearth by the time Abel stirred. She continued her work in the garden, and her small acts began to yield visible results. She staked the sprawling beanstalks with willow branches, lifting them toward the sun. She showed Sarah how to pinch the suckers from the tomato plants to encourage the plant's energy into the fruit. She transplanted the struggling herbs from a sun-scorched patch into the dappled shade beneath a lone apple tree, where they began to thrive. One afternoon, she found Sarah sitting on the porch steps, trying to mend a tear in her only other dress. The child's fingers were clumsy with the needle, and her face was tight with frustration. Lynn sat down beside her, not speaking, and simply held out her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah passed her the dress and the needle. Lynn's fingers moved with a fluid, practiced grace. She turned the fabric, her stitches so small and neat they were nearly invisible, closing the tear until it was a faint, clean line. She handed the dress back to Sarah. The little girl looked from the perfect seam to Lynn's face, and for the first time, her expression held something other than suspicion. It held a flicker of wonder. The true test, however, was Clementine. The mule was a creature of pure, undiluted stubbornness. She tolerated Abel, kicked at the hired hand, Ben, who came once a week to help with the heavy work, and refused to let Sarah anywhere near her. Her opinion of the world was low, and her ears were perpetually laid back to prove it. Lynn began leaving a small, bruised apple for the mule on a fence post each morning. At first, Clementine ignored it. Then, she began to eat it after Lynn had walked away. One day, Lynn stayed, standing perfectly still a few feet away. The mule watched her with one wary eye, then hesitantly took the apple. Lynn did not move. Slowly, she reached out a hand, not toward the mule's head, but low, toward her shoulder. The mule's skin twitched, but she did not pull away. Lynn's fingers gently stroked the coarse hair. From that day on, Clementine would allow Lynn to lead her from the paddock, a miracle that did not go unnoticed by the two silent observers who made up the rest of the household. Ben, the quiet ranch hand, was the first to give a sign. He was a lanky man who spoke even less than Abel. He would arrive, do his work, and leave with a simple nod. He'd watched Lynn in the garden, seen her with the mule. One day, as he was leaving, he stopped by where she was weeding. He held out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. For the girl, he mumbled, meaning Sarah, and pushed it into Lynn's hand before turning and walking away quickly, as if embarrassed by the act of giving. It was an acknowledgement. An acceptance. He had given the gift through her, making her a part of the transaction, a part of the family's small, closed circle. Abel saw it all. He saw the way his daughter was beginning to follow Lynn, the way the garden was flourishing, the way a quiet order was settling over his home. He resisted it. He had built walls around his heart after his wife passed, and he was not ready for them to be breached. But the stones were already beginning to loosen. The reciprocation, when it came, was as silent as the man who offered it. Abel noticed the soles of Lynn's cloth shoes were worn through to nothing, her feet stained with the mountain soil. He said nothing, but the next morning, a pair of worn but sturdy leather boots sat by the cabin door. They were too big, but they were whole. They had belonged to his wife, a fact that hung in the air between them, unspoken. Lynn looked at the boots, then at Abel's back as he chopped wood. She slipped them on, the worn leather a strange sort of comfort. They were a practical gift, nothing more, but they were also a shield against the harshness of the land. It was the first thing he had given her. A week later, Lynn woke to the smell of wood smoke and coffee. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the sight of 2 tin cups on the table instead of one. Abel was pouring coffee from the pot. He pushed one cup across the table toward her bench without a word, without meeting her eyes. It was a simple gesture, but it was monumental. It was an invitation to share the first ritual of the day, to move from the periphery to the center. She sat and drank the bitter coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest. She was no longer just the creature who slept in the corner. She was a person who sat at his table. The most significant change came in the form of wood and nails. Her straw tick in the corner was cold, the floorboards drawing warmth from her body even on summer nights. She never complained. It was better than what she'd had before. But one afternoon, Abel sent her and Sarah to the far meadow to gather wild berries. When they returned, a simple bed frame stood in the corner. It was made of raw, unfinished pine, but it was sturdy and well-built. It lifted her mattress off the floor. Abel was outside, sharpening an axe, his back to the cabin, as if the bed had simply appeared by magic. Lynn ran her hand over the smooth-planed wood. He had spent his afternoon, a rare break from the fieldwork, building this for her. He had seen her discomfort and answered it with work, the only language he knew how to speak. That night, for the first time since arriving, Lynn did not keep her small bundle of belongings tucked beside her as she slept. She placed it at the foot of her new bed, a small concession to the possibility of permanence. The first sign that the quiet peace of the mountain was about to be broken arrived on horseback, smiling. Marcus Fletcher rode up to the homestead one bright afternoon, his town clothes looking absurdly out of place against the wild backdrop. He swung down from his horse with an easy confidence, tipping his hat. "Croft," he said, his voice smooth as creek water. "Just making a neighborly call." And checking on our former property, his gaze slid to Lynn, who was washing vegetables by the water pump. There was a possessive, smug look in his eye that made her skin crawl. Abel came to the porch, his face a granite mask. He held a pitchfork, and he did not put it down. "What do you want, Fletcher?" "Just to see how the girl is settling in," Fletcher said, his smile never wavering. He walked toward the garden, his polished boot sinking slightly into the soft earth. My. You've been busy," he said to Lynn, his tone condescending. But his eyes were not on her. They were scanning the rows of thriving plants, the clever irrigation ditches Abel had dug from the creek, the healthy sheen on the corn stalks. His gaze lingered on the creek itself, which flowed cool and constant from higher up the mountain. "Good water source you have here." Reliable, it was not a question. It was an assessment. He was measuring the value of the land, not the well-being of the person on it. Before he left, he pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "Just some paperwork," he said, handing it to Abel. "To finalize the transfer of the indenture. A formality for the territorial clerk. Sign it when you have a moment." Abel took the paper, his suspicion palpable. He was a man who trusted his hands, not folded papers full of words. He could read, but slowly, sounding out the unfamiliar legal terms. He grunted and tucked the document onto the high mantelpiece inside the cabin, to be dealt with later. Lynn watched it go there, a white rectangle in the dim interior. It felt less like a piece of paper and more like a coiled snake, waiting in the shadows. Fletcher tipped his hat again, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and a sense of deep unease. The piece had been an illusion. The real price of that poker hand had yet to be collected. The trouble started subtly. A patch of yellowing leaves on the tomato plants, curled and brittle at the edges. Abel saw it and scowled, pulling the affected leaves and burning them. But the next day, the yellow had spread, a creeping sickness that moved from plant to plant with unnatural speed. Within a week, the entire tomato crop was blighted. Then, a fine white powder appeared on the broad leaves of the squash plants, and the beans began to wither on the vine. It was a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. The garden, their larder for the coming winter, was dying before their eyes. A quiet, desperate tension fell over the homestead. Abel worked tirelessly, applying every folk remedy he knew. He dusted the leaves with ash from the fire. He brewed a bitter tea from tobacco leaves and sprayed it on the plants. Nothing worked. The blight was relentless, moving through the garden like an invisible fire. He grew more silent, his frustration a palpable force. The prospect of a lean winter, of not having enough for his daughter, carved new, deeper lines into his face. He began calculating what he could sell, which calf would have to go, how they would manage. He was a man fighting a battle against an enemy he could not see and did not understand, and he was losing. Lynn watched it all, her heart heavy. She saw the fear behind Abel's stoicism, the worry in Sarah's eyes. She knew this was more than just a natural occurrence. The speed of it, the way it attacked multiple types of plants at once, felt wrong. It felt deliberate. She remembered Fletcher's careful assessment of the garden, his strange, lingering gaze. She walked the perimeter of the garden one evening, her eye scanning the soil. Near the fence post where Fletcher had tied his horse, she found it. A patch of ground where the weeds were not just dead, but scorched, blackened as if by poison. And a faint, chemical smell that did not belong on the mountain. She knew she could not prove it. But she did not need to prove who caused it to know how to fight it. For 2 days, she disappeared for hours at a time into the high meadows and deep woods, carrying a woven basket. She moved with a silent purpose, her eye scanning the forest floor. She gathered yarrow and plantain leaves, stripped bark from a particular type of willow tree, and dug for the gnarled roots of a plant the locals called burdock. Her basket filled with the mountain's hidden apothecary. Abel watched her go and come, his expression a mixture of doubt and desperation. He had tried his methods. They had failed. He had nothing left to lose by letting her try hers. That evening, as the last light faded, Sarah followed Lynn to the creek where she was washing the roots and leaves. "What are you doing?" the girl asked, her voice small. Lynn paused, crushing a fragrant leaf between her fingers. "In my home," she began, her English careful and precise, "my father was a physician. He taught me the ways of plants. He taught me that for every sickness in the soil, the mountain holds a cure." She looked at Sarah, her expression soft. "He also taught me to read, and to write. Not just our characters, but English letters, too. He was a scholar. He believed knowledge was a tool, like a shovel or an axe, but one you carry inside you." It was the most she had ever spoken about her past. She revealed it not with shame, but with a quiet dignity. She was not the worthless girl from the docks. She was the daughter of a learned man, sold into servitude after her family was disgraced by a corrupt official. Her silence and humility had been a shield, a way to survive in a world that would have crushed her if it knew her value. Sarah stared at her, her eyes wide with a new understanding. This small, quiet woman was not what she seemed. She was a secret, hidden in plain sight. Lynn worked through the night, crushing the plants and bark with a stone, steeping them in boiled creek water, creating a dark, pungent tea. At dawn, she began to administer the remedy. She did not just spray it. She took a soft cloth and gently, patiently, wiped down every afflicted leaf on every single plant. She poured the rest of the liquid around the roots. It was slow, painstaking work. One small thing at a time. Abel watched her for a long while, then he picked up a cloth and began to work on the next row, following her lead without a word. For 3 days, they worked together, tending the dying garden as if it were a sick child. And on the 4th morning, they saw it. A new, green shoot on a beanstalk. A tomato, small and hard, but unblemished. The blight was in retreat. The mountain, through Lynn's hands, had offered its cure. Just as the garden began its slow recovery, Fletcher returned. This time, he was not alone. He rode with Sheriff Miller, a portly man whose authority came more from his badge than his character. Fletcher's face was a mask of polite concern. "Sheriff," he said, loud enough for Abel to hear as he came to the porch. "I've had a report from a reliable source in town. Concerned that Mr. Croft is not upholding the terms of the indenture. That the girl is being worked like a field hand, not cared for as a ward or a wife. It was a clever, vicious attack, using the law and social propriety as a weapon." Abel's face darkened with rage. He was a private man, and this intrusion, this public questioning of his honor, was more galling than any physical threat. "She works alongside me. We work to eat," Abel said, his voice a low growl. "The contract is quite specific," Fletcher pressed, enjoying Abel's fury. "It implies a certain domestic arrangement. If those terms are violated, the contract is void. She reverts to my care." He was trying to get her back, but it was clear to Lynn, who watched from the doorway, that he did not want her. He wanted the chaos his claim would cause. He wanted to force Abel's hand. While the men argued on the porch, a cold certainty settled over Lynn. She looked at the mantelpiece. The folded document was still there. Abel had never signed it. Now, she understood why Fletcher had given it to him. It was a trap. With Abel and the sheriff distracted, she moved quickly. She took the paper from the mantel. Her hands did not shake as she unfolded it. The word swam before her eyes, dense legal text meant to confuse and intimidate. But she could read it. All of it. It was not a transfer of indenture. It was a quitclaim deed. By signing it, Abel would not be finalizing his claim on her. He would be signing away his exclusive rights to the creek, the water source that made his land so valuable, to Marcus Fletcher for the sum of $1. Fletcher's signature was already at the bottom, beside a neat line for Abel's. It was all a lie. The poker game had been a performance. Losing her was a calculated move to get a pawn onto this land, to create an excuse for these visits, and to put this fraudulent document into Abel's hands. The blight, she was now certain, was Fletcher's work as well, another tool to pressure a desperate man into signing anything that might offer a solution. She moved to the small wooden chest where Abel kept his important papers. She found the original deed to the homestead, the one signed by his father and the territorial land agent years ago. She placed the two documents side by side on the table. Abel's real signature was strong and sure. The one forged on the quitclaim was a passable imitation, meant to be added after the fact to make it look legitimate, but she saw the small hesitations in the ink, the slight tremor of a hand trying to copy rather than create. She had the proof. The argument on the porch had escalated. Sheriff Miller was looking uncomfortable, caught between two determined men. Abel, the law is the law, he was saying, clearly swayed by Fletcher's smooth talk. If the complaint is valid. Abel stood, a giant of a man rendered helpless, cornered by words he couldn't fight. He could break Fletcher in two with his bare hands, but he could not fight the whispers and the law books Fletcher wielded so expertly. At that moment, the cabin door opened. Lynn stepped out onto the porch. She was calm, her face composed, but her eyes held a fire Abel had never seen before. She held the two documents in her hands. She did not address Fletcher. She spoke directly to the sheriff. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, without a trace of an accent. "This is Mr. Croft's land deed." She held up the original, pointing to the bold signature. "And this," she said, holding up the paper Fletcher had brought, "is a fraud." Fletcher's smile finally vanished. "What is this nonsense? The girl is delirious." Lynn ignored him. "This paper is not about me," she told the sheriff. "It is a quitclaim deed for the water rights to this property. Mr. Fletcher brought it here hoping Mr. Croft would sign it without understanding its meaning. He wagered me in a card game he intended to lose, so he would have an excuse to be here." She laid the two papers on the porch railing, side by side. "This signature is a forgery. You can see the ink is different. The pressure is wrong." He meant to trick a man he believed could not read well enough to know the difference. Sheriff Miller stared at the papers, then at Fletcher's rapidly paling face. The smooth confidence had evaporated, replaced by the pinched look of a cheat who has been caught. The whole story was there, plain as day. The worthless girl was not worthless at all. She was literate, intelligent, and she had just dismantled his entire scheme with a few quiet sentences. Abel had stood frozen, watching her. He had never heard her speak so many words at once. He had never known the depth of her. He stepped forward, not toward Fletcher, but to her side. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He simply stood beside her, a silent, unshakable wall. His presence was a declaration, more powerful than any shout. He was with her. The sheriff looked from the papers, to Lynn's dignified calm, to Abel's silent support, and finally to Fletcher's panicked face. "Fletcher," he said, his voice now hard with authority. "Get off this mountain." Fletcher sputtered for a moment, then, seeing it was hopeless, snatched up his reins and mounted his horse, riding away without a backward glance, his respectable mask finally shattered. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not heavy with grief or unspoken tension. It was a comfortable, settled quiet. The threat was gone. After their simple meal, Lynn rose and went to the corner where her new bed stood. Her small, packed bundle was at its foot, where she had left it. Her purpose here, exposing Fletcher, was done. She was still, in the eyes of the law, property. She did not presume to know her place now. She reached down to pick up the bundle, her exit kept ready, as always. A large, calloused hand covered hers, stopping the motion. Abel stood over her, his shadow falling across the floor. "No," he said. The word was rough, almost a growl, but it held no anger. He reached down, picked up the bundle himself, and walked to the tall, dark wardrobe where his own spare clothes were kept. He opened it and placed her belongings on the highest shelf, tucking it deep into the back. Away. Out of reach. He closed the doors. He had, with one action, unpacked her bag for her. He turned back to her. His eyes, usually so guarded, were clear. "Stay," he said. It was not a command. It was a plea. He then walked back to the table, where 3 tin cups sat, waiting for the morning coffee. One for him, one for Sarah, and one for Lynn. Her place was set. "Thank you for staying until the end."